4 years ago, the residents of the city of Charleston's District 12, James Island, voted Carol Jackson as their next councilwoman. Now she's asking residents of District 12 to give her 4 more years to tackle issues such as flooding, traffic, and housing. I talked one-on-one with Carol for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Councilwoman Carol Jackson, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Quintin.
Oh, you're very welcome. I know that in my last interview with you, you told me that you were contemplating, obviously, re-election for District 12 on Charleston City Council. What got you from that point to right now as an incumbent?
Well, I was sort of, incremental evolving process. When I ran 4 years ago, I was motivated at that point by all of the younger homeowners and newer residents of James Island, impressing me that they were, getting involved and speaking out for their own interests and their concerns about how James Island was, ripe for redevelopment, overdevelopment. And so I thought I was joining a movement of younger families, and and that has continued. But the reality is I learn a lot by watching my kids. We have 2 daughters who are on either side of 40 at this point, and 2 sons-in-law and a grandson and dogs. And we all live out here within a mile of each other in the older neighborhoods of James Island. So I've learned a lot by watching them, work 2 professional jobs each, and just not have enough time in the day to really, take on an assignment like this in the way that I feel is necessary to be a responsive, constituent services oriented, council representative. So that was sort of, a big question mark in the back of my mind. Would I be able to locate someone that had, more of a lifespan to go than I do, but also have the kind of lifestyle situation that they would be able to, that I could proudly endorse or, help to elect a new candidate in my place. And I have not been successful in that quest. So, and then combined with the fact that over the last 4 years, the city has had to understandably become, now we're proactively, but I would say in the beginning of the climate impact events that started happening right before I was in office and has continued in terms of all of the, obvious challenges that we're having to meet now with flooding conditions and sea level rise and unsustainable infrastructure that never really had the budget or the willpower, the city leadership to be keeping up with what's really necessary to keep our neighborhoods safe. So we've got a lot on our plate, and I've spent a lot of my 4 years just, educating myself, learning all of the ins and outs of what it takes to put together the layers of public funding and, leadership support and buy-in by our stakeholder partners, the state, the county, the town of James Island, in my case. That's a lot. That's a lot to take in any one time. So I feel like I'm responsible. I've got the background. I've got the education. We just adopted the city plan, for example, which is a 10-year master plan for all the attributes of our city that we, feel responsible to move forward and have a long-lasting life for my grandson's, future here. He's 4 years old now. He was born while I was campaigning 4 years ago. Right. And I've watched him bloom where he's planted. I'm teaching him about our marsh out our front, neighborhood, and we're going to the DNR and walking around. Anyway, we have a lot to be responsible for and to, and I do feel like, I'm sort of poised to take the next trip around the bend to do that. We have to be working on zoning in response to everything that we learned during our city plan. We've got to be figuring out better traffic pattern, traffic calming measures for people that are, now not just using our main commercial through roads, but a lot of the historic designated roads that are still out here on James Island that, have come about because of agriculture. James Island was a huge, just a breadbasket for Charleston as an agriculture territory. And most of those roads have not changed. Some of them are still dirt. I have people down in the south end of the island that still have dirt roads in and out of their own driveways. But because traffic is congested, people are figuring out like cut-throughs.
Yes.
So, it's definitely a keeping up with the way that our territory is changing. And I've made a lot of friends. I know this is a long-winded monologue, but it really is the reason that I'm running. I feel like I've worked really hard to establish cross-jurisdictional, cross-utilities, you name it, all the contributors to a lifestyle that I want to help work on for my constituents and my kids and my neighbors. So I've worked really hard to get to know people in the town, the utilities, James Island Public Service District, their commissioners and their staff, Charleston Water System, our commissioners and their staff, the county representatives and their staff, and the state. I can't say enough about the two state reps that are my elected officials, Representative Spencer Wetmore of District 115 and Senator Sandra Sen of District 41 in the Senate. They have been hands-on partners to me. We've learned together what's important to our combined constituents, and it's been a real pleasure to serve with each of them in the last couple of years.
And do you actually have the budget right now for your district?
Well, that's a complicated question. We don't budget by district in the city. I have not watched your interview with my opponent, but I understand that was a question from some people who have seen that. And the truth is, we're a whole city, and so we don't budget. We don't look at expenditures in the variety of neighborhoods or boroughs, as we like to call them, outside the peninsula. Our budget is holistic, and basically, to be honest, because we have low density out here intentionally, that was one of the main things that I was impressed with, that my neighbors and the younger families that were moving into James Island liked the laid back sort of low density lifestyle. We all know that we need to improve opportunities on Folly Road, but that's really our major commercial corridor. And even then, we have a combined, what they call a zoning overlay district that is cooperative between the city and the county and the town, right, that limits height along Folly Road for commercial properties to 2.5 stories, 35 feet. So we're never going to be the downtown, cash cow of providing density that brings in more of a tax base and more of the customers that use our hospitality tax and or contribute to the hospitality tax. And certainly we're not going to have hotels out here. So we don't pay probably as an island of city neighborhoods and taxpayers. It's very residential, distinct residential properties. We don't even have a lot of townhouse neighborhoods yet. I think that might be coming in a future era that probably won't involve me, but we are, going to be considering how to house people more affordably. And that's one of the assignments I've given to myself, is to, look into things like missing middle housing that really does get back to the era that my family grew up in. My parents, after the World War II, used their GI Bill, and they bought, a duplex, and they lived very comfortably in a smaller neighborhood where we all had an alley to play in, or a little central, courtyard around several of the duplex properties. And it was a great way to grow up as a kid, because you got to have friends and you were safe. So I think there's more and more families that are wanting to live in that kind of lifestyle. give up the big 5,000 square foot house until maybe they've had the opportunity to raise their families in a more affordable and better located condition. So we do have that on James Island. We have that opportunity, but it's not going to happen in any sort of big density way. We're not building apartment properties. We're not building condominiums. I know people worry about that all the time. My motto when I ran 4 years ago is preserve and protect James Island, because that is as responsive to the overall citizenry, whether it's city, town, or county residents, as we can possibly be. And I don't think there's any reason to, back away from that. That continues to be what informs my voting and my thinking about James Island. So in terms of taxes, we budget the biggest user of our tax pie, if you think about it as one finite pie, is our public safety, the Charleston Police Department and the Charleston Fire Department. And so we don't even allocate, per resident what it costs to have a cop on your patrol. We don't have enough police out here right now. We have Team 3 that covers James and Johns Island for the city. And so we have 40 positions that are budgeted, or 39 positions, sworn officer positions that are budgeted, and right now only 29 are filled. So we need more policing. The good news is that years ago, not that many years ago, but before I took office, certainly, there was a cooperative agreement signed between the Sheriff's Office Department and the city police department. So we share patrols, but the weird thing about it that's still controlled at the state level is, like, I live next door to somebody who has in the town of James Island. They pay taxes to the town of James Island, and then so let's say there's a burglar that came to my house and started, and I called 911. A city cop or a sheriff's cop might come, depending on who is the closest. That's the kind of response, a cooperative agreement we have now. But if it was a sheriff's deputy who came to my door, they wouldn't be able to arrest a burglar in my own yard because they don't have arresting jurisdiction. They could hold him, they couldn't arrest him. And if the guy or girl would run across the street to my neighbor's yard in the town and a city cop had come to check out the 911 call, it would be the opposite. They couldn't arrest a person by the time they were in a town, yard. So it's really dumb. I think that's something that, we're working with our state delegation to take care of in jurisdictions like ours that share policing responsibilities across those municipal jurisdictions. But anyway, I've learned a lot, Quintin. I feel like, I'm a student of people, first of all, and I've really enjoyed understanding the challenges and the opportunities to work more collegially across my island of responsibility.
A few years ago, Carol, you wrote to the James Islanders on North Next Door that you supported 2 of the 3 small boutique-type hotels on Folly Road. This was when a hotel was proposed in the town of James Island. What is your view of Folly Road right now?
Well, I think that's sort of an overstatement quote. That was like a day or two of back and forth conversation on Nextdoor, mostly complaining about all of the car washes that were being approved up and down Folly Road that are by right uses for the general business district that we all have. So there were 2 in the city that were going through a review process, and 1 in the town, as I recall. And so people were just talking about, their choices for development. Why do we have to have so many car washes? Why can't we have some cool things that we would all like to, be customers of or whatever? And at the end, it sort of got convoluted with the hotel decision that the town had just made or was being asked to make. I've forgotten the timing about that. To establish as part of their general business zoning that their hotels could be potentially approved by a special exception process in the town. And so at the end of a very long weekend, I said, well, there's no way that the city would have a hotel on James Island because our accommodations district only applies to downtown. So we don't have, and West Ashley. So we don't have an accommodations district on James Island. And that would be a cold day and you know what, before we would ever agree to that. But I personally said, I think there could be some value in having like a boutique size hostlery hotel, B&Bs that, people could stay in on their way to Folly Beach. But it would not be even the hotel that was just tentatively being proposed for the town property. And that's a big piece of land, but it was the total wrong location. It was right up against the marsh. So I think I was just, I was saying what I thought could be interesting as a citizen, but certainly not anything that we've ever had a policy vote on or a zoning vote. And if there was a conversation about having an accommodations district on James Island, I think knowing the way that my constituents feel now, I would vote no. So, but nobody's bringing that up. It's sort of a lost leader conversation, I think.
Do you support properties on Folly Road being combined for larger redevelopment?
Companies or properties?
Properties.
I think if the landowners, entertain such a thing, it's all about the rightful use of property. For me, it's more about the use and the, then what happens when a use comes in. If you know Folly Road at all, it's basically a half a block deep as a commercial district. Right behind the backside of every commercial user on Folly Road is a residential property owner that backs up. So it's basically a half a block deep on either side. And so that's the biggest concern to me, is what is the residual impact on creating bigger, more commercially intense uses that would, have a harder impact, a more negative impact on the residential side of that block. And we only do combinations like that, case by case. It's not like you're going to go down the list and say you have to combine. It's truly a property rights, ownership state, and the way that we zone things in the city. So it would have to be two owners getting together and coming together with a proposal. But for me, it's about the intense use.
Isn't this exactly what is happening, where the Refuel gas station will be built, 4 properties combined for a large gas station?
Yeah, I mean, Refuel or whoever was the developer for them came to the owners and they all agreed to sell. I don't know if it was 4. I think that combination was before my time. It had happened a while ago. But anyway, yes. And so because it became, one property with the same use, they didn't even have to go in for a rezoning, in my recollection. A lot of this had happened before I was actually in office, I think. But if all of those 4 little properties, let's assume it's 4 because you're saying it's 4, if they all had a general business zoning type, then there wouldn't even be any challenge to the use. It would just then become a bigger piece of property that, can do that. My son-in-law, he's a cool innovator, business guy, entrepreneur, and it took him a long time, but in West Ashley, he has just finally opened Turbo Cone. So I have to give him a little plug. It's the best soft serve ice cream. It's one of a kind. You got to go there. But he bought 3 properties side by side, and one was a parking lot. They had 3 separate property tax numbers, which is how they're separately, recorded. So he bought 3 properties, but the same owner had owned them for a long time. And basically he left the parking lot as one property. The office building that he took over, low-rise office building where he runs his back of the house, ice cream shop, and then he's going to rent out the front to a business. And then the side lot was always a vacant lot, and that's where he built the hangout space for TurboCone. So it's a covered over patio area. Anyway, it's the same use, 3 separate properties. So that's another way of doing that. But he had the same zoning on each one of those 3 properties. So there was never a question about him being able to own and operate a soft serve place.
And I know that you obviously are a champion for conservation cluster zoning, which obviously passed city council. Does it allow for accessory dwellings?
Yeah, it does. I wouldn't say that I was a champion. What I was a champion for was taking away the sunsetting, that's what they call it in zoning world, for ending the cluster zoning ordinance that was in effect when I first moved here and when I came into office. So my main thrust was to stop that because it was too many. The minimum acreage for a cluster was only 5 acres, and that meant that you could put pretty dense subdivisions in the middle of older neighborhoods or wherever. You could find a 5-acre piece of property, tear down some houses, and voila, you had 5 acres, right? So I knew that was too dense and too risky for the remaining land that is around James Island. It's no mystery. Developers look for the best land to build on when they're discovering a new territory. And James Island has very few higher elevation locations. We have Folly Road, basically, and Maybank Highway, right, and parts of Harbor View. Up by the harbor, it's very high over the river. But those are all neighborhoods, spider web neighborhoods, I like to call them, because they're one way in and one way out, and you twirl around, and everybody's got a beautiful little cul-de-sac. Anyway, so there's not that much land left on James Island to develop. And when you only have 5-acre minimum requirement, to me, that's risky development, especially when we didn't have the same higher regulations for controlling stormwater design. So those two things together, were a worry to me from day one. That was probably the biggest citizens advocacy arena that I followed from the time that I moved here to the time that I ran for office. And so I worked really hard, to try to mitigate the impact of a small cluster like that. It took me a long time. I was brand new. I was the only woman on council. You have to earn your respect among your colleagues. So I tried working with the staff to do just a timeout moratorium on that kind of build out. And my colleagues on council would not entertain a moratorium, even though it was going to be, temporary. I tried to put in a temporary change to the stormwater for just those needing special flood protection hazard areas that would match some of the improvements that we had just done to Church Creek. So it was like a Church Creek light stormwater set of regulations. That got a little more traction among my colleagues. We really, entertained it. But at the end of the day, that was defeated. The good news was by then we were working on the stormwater regulations to raise them to a whole new level of standards that do contribute to a lot of the safety factors that we all need to prevent flooding from a new property out into the territory that it's filled into. So that's one good measure that we're all very happy to have, as part of our toolkit for managing protective development. But the other one was the cluster. So yes, I worked really hard to get the cluster terminated. And as a corollary, we now have the conservation ordinance. It does sort of do the same thing, but it starts at 10 acres. So there'll be many fewer opportunities for builders. I can't say that I'm a big fan of adding the ADUs. My theory about affordable housing, because I was in affordable housing for the last 20 years of my work life in Northern Virginia, and my theory about housing that's going to be long-term affordable to working families is it needs to be combined with transit-oriented locations. You can't put affordable housing in and call it a cluster, conservation cluster area and give it some affordability and still have those people driving in from outer West Ashley or down on South James Island or way out in Cane Hoy and coming to work in the district or in North Charleston. That's not an affordable lifestyle. I worked in that industry, for 15 years and watched my employees have to move further and further out into the suburbs of Northern Virginia. My property manager, the last 2 years I was there, I worked in the city of Alexandria, which is exactly like Charleston,
Right.
including being the second oldest historic preservation ordinance in the country. So my property manager, we paid her a decent wage, but it wasn't top dollar because we were a nonprofit getting government money to subsidize our senior housing properties. She commuted one way, 2 hours. One way, 2 hours in, 2 hours out. She had a 10-year-old boy. She never saw him play sports. She never, she had to take off half a day just to go to his PTA meetings. It's not an affordable quality lifestyle when you say you're going to build workforce housing in a place that's hard to get to and hard to live in for those sorts of, family lifestyles. So that's why I don't really like the ADUs. It's great for granny flats. If we could have limited, but fair housing laws don't let you limit them to, like seniors. So my colleagues were much more excited about having the ADUs and the workforce housing portion than I was, frankly, because I do think that location matters.
And what areas would be ideal for that type of workforce housing in your district?
Well, if we could do some, like low density around Folly Road area or the Maybank corridor that's now, people are buying up properties. It's going to happen no matter what. So as long as we, guide them. My goal for creating missing middle housing, which I will publicize again. Missing middle housing means housing that is naturally affordable. So you don't even need to subsidize it as a government. It's not workforce housing that you need to put public money into. You create the zoning incentives for developers to want to build that kind of housing stock. So that's my theory about good housing philosophy and policy, is that you take the land where you've got the transit corridor. Think about Sam Rittenberg Boulevard. It can be the main street between North Charleston and Charleston, West Ashley, and one of the main ways into Charleston, so that people coming in to our region don't even have to go downtown to just turn around and go out again. So I'm trying to train my husband to get off on Route 7 and go in to our home that way through West Ashley, and appreciate that we don't have to go in to the crosstown and get flooded out every time we drive through there. It's retraining people's lifestyle habits, but to incentivize walkable, affordable, fun housing for people that are moving here or starting their families or wanting to have a group house, out of college. That's where people want to live. I came from Northern Virginia. Arlington County is one of the main models for how to take transit-oriented, and sure, they have a metro system, which we'll never have here. But if we would put it around some sort of, trolley system that would run back and forth between Azalea Drive and, down to Route 17 along Sam Rittenberg, just think about it. How many people would not be in their cars, at least on a weekend, and if we can build some live work corporate headquarters and that kind of thing, then people could live and work there. That's what Arlington did.
And how many subsidized senior properties are there in your district right now?
How many what?
Subsidized senior properties.
We have a lovely Habitat for Humanity homeowners community. It's beautiful. Nobody knows where it is because it just all fits into the scene. I'm not naive. I know that when I was doing nonprofit housing, everybody called it public housing, project housing, that kind of housing. We don't want it. It's good. We believe in affordability, but not in our neighborhood, right? That's what you call NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So I had my share of, challenges with people who wanted to have affordable housing, but not in their backyard. So we have this beautiful Habitat for Humanity community, and it's you would never know from if you're looking at it from the surface, you would never know that that the homeowners, have a forgivable loan there. It's really great. We don't have any other subsidized. We have Charleston Housing Authority has a couple of low-rise multifamily properties. One's in my neighborhood. There are a few others scattered around James Island. We have an apartment community that, is sort of naturally affordable because it's been here a longer time, so the rents don't have to be like downtown prices. We own a rental property. My husband and I do the first house we lived in on James Island. We keep it affordable for somebody who works in the food and bev industry. So we could get probably $300 more a month than we are asking that gentleman to pay us. But that's sort of our contribution to having some affordable workforce housing on James Island.
And going back to stormwater standards, obviously, Carol, what stormwater standards would contribute to the future of your district?
Well, it's a combination. We need ongoing maintenance. We're not halfway done with basically just reclaiming the stormwater drainage systems that were built out here, subdivision by subdivision. A lot of them were basically built on, like my neighborhood, and even later in the years, my neighborhood was put together in the 50s. But even neighborhoods like where my daughter lives over on the other side of Folly Road were subdivided in the 60s and the 70s. Basically, they took the old farm ditches and just, ran them together. So made them connect across the new streets that they were allowing developers to build. But there wasn't a lot of engineering going on back then when the county was just, allowing people to redevelop their land. And once some of those neighborhoods started annexing into the city, again, it was a whole different era. People didn't know that much about, flood control. There'd never really been that kind of major storm surge when most of the spiderweb neighborhoods were even subdivided in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Hugo had hit, but Hugo was actually nice to James Island, if you can say that, with a caveat that it was a horrible storm, but it went north of the peninsula. So when I was campaigning 4 years ago, Hurricane Irma had just come through. Thankfully, it didn't push that much wind ashore, but it was the worst storm surge from the sea flooding than Hugo. So I called on a lot of people over in the Clarks Point neighborhood, Clark Sound neighborhoods, and they had destroyed docks and the water was coming all the way up into their backyards. And people who lived there, in their homes during Hugo and then again for Irma said Irma was 10 times worse than Hugo for their own property safety. So we've got to be making the older neighborhoods and the older drainage systems as functional as we possibly can. And that's literally like neighborhood by neighborhood. We've got to keep educating people to adopt a storm drain, adopt a ditch, and keep them clear so that when rain does come down, the water will flow the way it's designed to do that. My husband and I converted our front yard into a rain-catching basin at the beginning of COVID just to have something to do, but I'd been studying what Clemson Extension was teaching citizens about how to control and catch water so it doesn't, and we live across the road from a huge section of Ellis Creek Marsh that is toxic, as you've probably read about. Right. So, and the rain would come across. 3 new houses were built across the street from us about the same time, and it's just a matter of fact. When you add more surface to open land, where our other neighbor had 1 house on the same amount of property, water runs off. It doesn't, So we cut the water. We're catching the water, and we're stopping it from going further down to our neighbor's house. And it's a really cool garden. So come out and see it. 1461 Patterson Avenue. But it's that kind of thing. We need to educate people, and then we need to do some major improvements. not to the extent that West Ashley needs them, or the peninsula certainly needs like major new infrastructure. James Island was benefited by the development of Walmart, which was on a huge piece of property, and Walmart's agreement at that time was they were going to handle a huge drainage basin that comes from both sides of Folly Road, and so that's a pretty, compared to the older drainage systems from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Walmart drainage system is still working pretty well. But we've got challenges. If we allow development, in places where it's never been before, that's where we're going to have to do radical improvements, and that will be on the developers, because that is the new regulations for our stormwater management game plan.
And speaking of Folly Road, what type of zoning should happen along Folly Road from Grimble to Saul Legree?
I mean, I like the way it is right now. Preservation, neighborhood conservation and preservation. That is probably the most at risk part of our island for low-lying sea level rise impacted flooding. The tidal creek systems are there, and there's never been, there's really no elevation to speak of. So anyone who would build there, I don't know if you go down to Folly Beach, but there's some few little houses that are stuck in. They're on the way to Saul Legree, so they're not part of the city limits. But they're like tight up against the road. They're 15 feet high, and if you go on a king tide day, under their house, it's flooding. So that's just not acceptable to me. And I can't imagine that over time those houses are going to be, as valuable as they are right now, because people still are sort of, choosing to, I think it's all going to get better in the future, or whatever they're telling themselves as they buy a house, in a place that will certifiably get more flooding just because of the climate impacts that are undeniable, in my opinion, at this point in time. Undeniable to scientists. I'm not making this up. I read, everything. We've got Charleston Resilience Network is a great resource of academics and practitioners and policymakers and investors who are thinking about how to keep Charleston resilient into the long, long future that we all hope to have. So I've been paying attention to them, meeting with them, asking them questions ever since I moved here.
Yes, ma'am. And let me ask you this, Carol. What particular communities, such as along Saul Legree, should be protected, elevated, and enhanced?
Well, I confess I'm not an expert on Saul Legree, because that is in unincorporated county, but I have friends who live there, and I hope and pray that we don't see a lot of infill building there. I think Saul Legree has a historic character as a longstanding African American settlement community that basically was pushed aside, by during the sharecropping era, because it's not in a safe place as far as water is concerned. So people were allowed to own their own properties there, and it became a very tight-knit community, in my understanding. And it had its heyday, obviously, during the height of Jim Crow segregation, where African Americans weren't allowed on Folly Beach. So that became the beach community for any African Americans who lived on this side of the peninsula, is my understanding from people who experienced that or whose parents and grandparents did. So it has a very unique and endearing and enduring character for all those reasons, as a tight-knit Black community. But ecologically and environmentally and elevation zoning sensitive, it's just not a smart place to be putting a lot of density, because it's going to flood. So I'm hoping that, and the corollary to that, Quintin, which is a real tension, and I went through this in my housing work in Virginia, but even more now I'm watching it play out my first part of my career was with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, as an example. So I came to Charleston in the early 80s after Mayor Riley was trying as hard as he could to sort of build up the economy on the peninsula to serve, as a new economic engine for the whole city. And tourism was the name of that game. And he worked with my organization to learn, how to use your history and attract, the tourism industry that now is no one would have imagined how, robust and popular and frankly out of control. In my opinion, it needs to be. We need to have a balancing act now for our economy. But anyway, I saw Charleston as the sort of frozen in ice community that it had been, let's say, through the after integration. It sort of became a very well balanced demographic community, white and black. There was thriving black neighborhoods that had learned during segregation to, fend for themselves economically. And in talking to people that I know lived downtown during that era of the 60s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, 80s, it was like the black community was more stable than the white community in terms of everybody knowing each other, getting along, helping each other out. Somebody said to me, well, my doctor lived next to my garbage man, and nobody cared. It was a very stable, well-knit community. The good news about integration was that we didn't have to have those sorts of safety net, holistic communities for African Americans to feel like they were safe and not under some other, more detrimental laws and things. But the bad news was it did sort of change the fabric of knowing where neighborhoods were. My husband and I bought our first property in Charleston in 2002 so that our daughter could share the home that we bought with her college classmates. And that was in the heart of what's now called Elliott Borough, Cannon Borough. It was mostly a black neighborhood. We got to know all those neighborhoods. We were 2 houses up from the lovely, it was a parking lot on the corner, but the church was actually behind us on Cannon Street. And it was still a very stable neighborhood. Unfortunately, the 10 plus years that we owned it, a lot of those older African American property owners, aged out, wanted to leave a legacy or their wealth, to their children. So they sold their homes. And then those homes were moved into by up and coming, newcomers to the city. Didn't really have that sense of place, and really just wanted, like their own fun in a cool older neighborhood. And at the same time, more crime was coming in through the whole drug, sale industry and things like that. There were 2 drive-by shootings just up the street at the mom and pop grocery store where our house was on Cumming Street, so corner of Spring and Cumming. And I talked to whoever the detective was during that time to find out what the heck was happening, because nobody had had any experience of that. And he said, well, Mrs. Jackson, best we can figure out is, the New Jersey, drug syndicate has discovered Charleston as a good place to do their thing. So it's cyclical. You can't really ever say a neighborhood is going to be the same from one era to the next. I do hope and pray that, white and black are living, in as good neighbors together. We know for a fact that gentrification has just diminished the African American population. Got the census numbers a month or 2 ago, and I'm looking at them right now in terms of racial. So right now we have our total population for the city of Black or African American citizens, residents, is 17%. And in 2010, it was 26%, and in 2000 it was 35%. So, that's a loss. That's a loss to our history, it's a loss to our people, it's a loss to our community. I don't know the answer to, seeing those numbers stabilize, because property values are through the roof. People have the right to sell their property. We're trying to do a lot of education. The heirs property, I don't know if you've ever interviewed the heirs property organization, the Center for Heirs Property. I highly recommend that you get some of them on a Zoom with you. They're working their brains out to help people understand the value of their legacy of real estate, above the temptation of selling out for a number that they would never imagine their home or their land might be worth, because that's a short-term gain for a long-term loss. You can't get your land back. 95% of us on James Island wouldn't be able to buy our property today at its current prices with the income that we have. So property creates wealth, and or at least grows your asset. There's no other way to do that in the United States of America that's more predictable and reliable. But you can't sell out. You end that chain. So that's why we see areas like our Tri-County region, way out beyond Somerville. I mean, who thought that there was going to be subdivisions in Holly Hill and Ridgeville and Harleyville and all those old Main Street towns? Nobody. That's happened just since we moved here in 2013. That's the way growth is going. That's what's going to keep our state highways clogged up. People are going to be commuting because they can find cheaper living arrangements and leave the city, but their job, the good news is that there is some manufacturing and things like that that are following the 26 corridor. So it won't be as bad as if everybody was still coming downtown to work in the medical district or whatever. But it's the nature of the beast. You can't really control that because people need to be able to use their money as wisely as they can. But we are trying to work hard to work on people that would like to stay in their older neighborhoods where they grow up, or have that available as a resource for their legacy for their children. Be able to do that.
Councilwoman Carol Jackson, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you, Quintin. I appreciate it.
You're
Thanks.
welcome.
And everybody vote on November 2nd. If you have a council race going on, or the Water Commission is also electing a water commissioner. So it's very important. Thank you.
Thank you.